Well, hello, everyone. I'm James Dobson, and you're listening to Family Talk, a listener-supported ministry. In fact, thank you so much for being part of that support for James Dobson Family Institute.
Well, welcome to Family Talk. I'm Roger Marsh, and you may have heard that yesterday was Giving Tuesday. Well, on behalf of Dr. James Dobson and all of us here at the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute, we want to thank you, everyone who supported us with a thoughtful financial gift as we work toward meeting that $75,000 matching gift that was in place yesterday. Now, we are a listener-supported broadcast outreach, and we would not be able to make Family Talk possible without your generous financial support and your prayers as well. So for everyone who made a donation yesterday on Giving Tuesday, thanks so much. Now, on today's program, we're going to hear a dynamic presentation given by our own Gary Bauer. He recently made this presentation in Colorado Springs, which is also the headquarters of Family Talk. We'll hear him share some historical background on important Christian movements from yesterday and why we need to stand together today. Of course, Gary Bauer is the Senior Vice President of Public Policy here at the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute. He's also the host of the podcast here at JDFI called Defending Faith, Family, and Freedom. Gary is married to his wife, Carol, and together they have 3 grown children. So without further ado, let's join Gary Bauer right now, right here on Family Talk.
Thank you over there. I know how Eric feels. I got a partial standing ovation over there. Ronald Reagan told me once that if I was ever introduced to give a speech and I got a standing ovation, that I probably should sit down right away because I had nowhere to go but down after that. So he gave me no advice on partial standing ovations, so I'm just going to stay up here and carry on. Thank you for hanging in here. This has been an incredible conference. I hope you agree. But it's also been a heavy conference with a lot of difficult messages, a lot of things to process. We were talking at dinner tonight about a lot of old stories about how I got into this battle. And Dr. Dobson, I started thinking back on when I left the White House, and you and I had been talking about, sort of putting the Family Research Council on steroids. It was a dream, and we wanted to move forward on it. I came out and met with Jim to talk about it. It was going to cost some money. I was going to be paid, a reasonable salary. But around the same time, I got approached by a law firm in Washington, D.C. They wanted me as their token conservative. And, they put a very interesting offer on the table. Between bonuses and the rest of it, I was going to be making 7 figures. And so I knew what I wanted to do, but I felt like a good spouse, I should go home at dinner that night and talk to Carol about it and just kind of share my thinking with her. And I said, well, honey, I talked to this law firm, and I talked to Dr. Dobson. If I go with Dobson and do this thing, it's going to be this. But the law firm offered me basically $1 million, but Carol, as you know, I wouldn't be happy. And she looked at me a second and she said, well, couldn't you be unhappy for a couple of years? That did not actually happen, but I love telling that story. She gets furious, and I can tell you, I'm not going to have a good night tonight. It's not going to be a good night. That's all there is to it. She said, of course, take the Dobson project with FRC and the rest of his history. But look, Jim, it's fantastic to be back alongside of you in this work after everything we've been through and at a time like this. And that's been a theme of this whole conference, right? What time is it? Eric touched on it in a very articulate way, but it's come up multiple times in the last couple of days. It's not the 1980s. It's not God blessing morning in America, Ronald Reagan's great slogan. It's not morning in America. It's more like a couple of minutes to midnight. It feels a little bit like the 1960s, but it's worse than the 1960s. The 1960s had a lot of this stuff we're dealing with, but it was a counterculture. It was challenging the prevalent culture in America. Now it is the culture of America. We're the counterculture. So it's not really the 1960s. It's not the 1950s. I Like Ike ain't going to do it. It's a lot closer to the 1850s, quite frankly. In the 1850s, we had one difference of opinion that could not be reconciled, could not be compromised. Either one man could own another man, or one man could never own another man. What's the middle ground there? There had to be a great war. 600,000 people died to prove that no man is born with a saddle on his back, and other men born with spurs to ride him. Well, I can list 10 different things of which there are irreconcilable differences today. What, that's going to be resolved if we get the House and Senate, but they have the White House, or we get all three, and we're going to be able to ram down their throats our answer to all these things that cannot be reconciled? We're at a moment in which I think we are, for better or worse, going to see things and hear things and read headlines that are going to shake us to our very core. Did anybody think 4 weeks ago you were going to wake up and see headlines that said 1,400 Israelis massacred? That wasn't on my radar screen. I had an acquaintance that lived in Paris, and he was a guy that loved reading history. He would stay up late at night reading history books, novels based on actual history. And he particularly liked, and Eric would be interested in this, he particularly liked the 1930s. He used to think, what would I have done, he said to me. I would think about that. I would sit there with a glass of wine. What would I have done in the 1930s? Would I have been part of the resistance? Would I have hidden a Jew in my attic? And he said, then one morning, as I was doing chores around my apartment, I heard shouting from the street outside. And he said, I went out on my balcony and I looked out on the street, and there were men walking in the street, and they carried the Israeli flag, but they had cut out the Star of David and they had replaced it with a swastika, and they were chanting death to the Jews. This was years ago. And he said, I looked at my neighbor's balcony, and my neighbor was watering her plants. And then I looked over here and I saw a guy I know on the floor below me, and he was going to work. They were acting like the men in the street outside of our building were chanting for the local soccer team. And he said, suddenly it hit me. I'm wasting my time thinking about what I would have done in the 1930s. What am I going to do now? What we're seeing in the streets of America, this hundreds of thousands of people chanting gas the Jews, death to the Jews. There's never been anything like this in the history of America. Oh, look, there's been many, many years, many decades when a Jew couldn't get into certain country clubs, might not be able to get into every college. I know that's hard to imagine, but there were times when a lot of universities didn't allow Jewish students in. Some corporations had an unwritten rule. Well, we're not going to promote a Jewish guy too high up in the organization. Now, all those things were wrong. But hundreds of thousands of people marching in the street, calling for a second genocide? This is of a completely different order. There was a question about whether Eric has a chance to talk to Jewish leaders. It's an interesting question. There is no historical hatred like Jew hatred. It is the longest hatred in history. It is the most universal hatred. In the Passover Seder, the Jewish people, probably for 2,000 years, one of the lines they say, in every generation, they arise to annihilate us. Jews, I believe, are hated at least in part because they were chosen. God in the desert, meeting Abram, I am your God, you will be my people. He who blesses you, I will bless. He who curses you, I will curse. And I imagine Satan over there floating around saying, oh yeah, well, we'll see about that. I've met many Jews who say, Gary, you people keep saying we're the chosen people. Quite frankly, I would have just preferred not to be chosen. The idea of a single God came from the Jewish people in that meeting in the desert. The basic legal code of Judeo-Christian civilization came from the Jewish people, the 10 Commandments.
You're listening to Family Talk, and I'm Roger Marsh, just jumping in here for a brief moment, reminding you that we're listening to a presentation given by our own Gary Bauer. Gary, of course, is the Senior Vice President of Public Policy here at the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute. He's also the host of the Defending Faith, Family, and Freedom podcast here at the JDFI. Now, let's rejoin Gary Bauer for the conclusion of his dynamic presentation right here on Family Talk.
95% of the Bible was written by Jews. The patriarchs are all Jews. When Christ returns, he will come back to the actual Jerusalem. He will stand on the Mount of Olives, and it will split in two. The Jordan River will start flowing in the opposite direction. The people who want to erase the history of the Jews from the Holy Land would, if they succeeded, erase the history of us from the Holy Land. The Jews were in the Holy Land when Washington, D.C. was still a swamp. So Judeo-Christian civilization is under attack. And Israel and the United States are the two pillars of that civilization. Did you hear the phone call that one of the men that carried out the massacre made? He called his parents. And when you listen to the recording, the happiness in his voice sounds like what we would have sounded like to call our parents and say, you're going to be grandparents. But he was calling to say this: I killed 10 Jews with my own hands. I'm using the Jew woman's phone to call you right now. His proud mother responds, may Allah protect you. And at the highest levels of our State Department and Pentagon and our president are going to microphones and saying, well, as soon as this trouble is over with, the only long-term solution is 2 states living side by side in peace. This is insanity. You can't live side by side with that. So Israel's under attack, and America's under attack in every way conceivable. And many of the speakers tonight have alluded to it and talked about it. America's in a crisis in some ways like the crisis of 1776, when we dared to rebel against the motherland. And this idea we had of setting up a country that would be built on the idea that liberty comes not from government, but from God. And that because liberty comes from God, and we're made in the image of God, this country and Western civilization was based on the idea that it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is or how much money you have in the bank. It doesn't matter if you're a newborn with Down syndrome or 99 years old with dementia. You have dignity and value and worth. And this civilization, based on that idea, has brought more freedom, more opportunity to more people than any system in the history of the world. And we are teetering on the edge of a cliff. We are on the verge of losing it all. In 1776, Thomas Paine knew what the time was. He wrote a pamphlet called The American Crisis. The first lines are, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." George Washington was so moved by the words that Paine had so captured the moment that he ordered his officers to read the pamphlet to the soldiers that were still in the colonial army. They were losing men every day. They hadn't been paid in months. Men were going home. As you know, many of them were barefoot. The odds were not good. After that pamphlet was read, we were on the road to victory. Thank God we didn't have only sunshine patriots and summer soldiers at the birth of the nation, or we would have been stillborn. But what will happen to us now? We're not led by George Washington's. We got Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. What if all we have today are sunshine Christians and summer pastors, a theme that we've talked about the past 2 days? We will die as a nation. Again, I apologize for repeating some of these themes, but it's like telling your wife you love her. There's some things you can't say often enough, right? Truths have to be repeated. Do any of you think it was a surprise to God that you were born in America? Of course it wasn't. He knew where you were going to be born, or that you actually were able to come to America at some point. We have immigrants in the audience. Do you think that surprised God? When you were born in America, that was a decision by God. He blessed you in one of the most important, magnificent ways you could have been blessed. You have enjoyed freedom of religion. You have lived in a decent country. This Sunday, all over the world, Christians that were not so blessed in countries that are not decent places will leave modest homes and walk for miles to get to a church to hear the word of God, knowing that what they are doing with their family may be the last thing they do on this earth. Because on Sundays all over the world, there are forces and movements that go Christian hunting. They blow up churches. They mow down Christians, leaving those churches. So when I hear a pastor saying, "I'm not going to get in all of that, Eric, I'm as angry about it as you are," those pastors are ingrates. They've been given this great gift, and they're not willing to do anything to defend it, to preserve it. The neo-Marxist left's plan is absolutely clear. It is to rip us out of the rich soil of Judeo-Christian civilization. Do you love Jesus? Of course you love Jesus. If I asked everybody to raise your hand, all hands would go up. Do you love America? Of course, all your hands would go up. That is a description of the overwhelming majority of the American people for 95% of our history. They loved God, they loved Jesus, and they loved America. Today, that's called Christian nationalism, and it is a very bad thing, we're told. They're already labeling the new Speaker of the House a Christian nationalist. Your neighbors and even some of your friends are being taught in all kinds of ways, in the media, in the popular culture. Hey, the people living next to you, they may be one of those Christian nationalists. Be careful, those are extremists. Who knows what they might try to do next? Yeah, we all are familiar with a lot of Abraham Lincoln's incredible speeches, the Gettysburg Address. They used to memorize those things in school when I was growing up, probably for many of you too. By the way, if you have never read Lincoln's second inaugural, you got to do it. One page. And in one page, he refers directly or indirectly to God and the Bible 13 times. It's not taught in the schools anymore. How would they explain all those references to God by an American president. Hadn't he heard about the separation of the church and state? If you get your kids just to read the second inaugural, they will have an incredible weapon in their arsenal to resist the lies we're being subjected to.
Well, that was one powerful presentation given by our own Gary Bauer here on Family Talk, calling Christians everywhere to stand firm in our Judeo-Christian values. Now, if you enjoyed what you heard on today's broadcast, be sure to join us again tomorrow when you'll hear part 2 of Gary's presentation. You will not want to miss it. And if you'd like to listen again or share today's program with a friend, remember you can easily do so using our official JDFI Family Talk app right on your smartphone. If you prefer, you can also find it online when you go to drjamesdobson.org/Family Talk. Now, if you've been inspired by what you heard on today's program, you will definitely want to learn more about what it means to be a Christian citizen in today's world. And a good place to advance your knowledge is with a special 3-disc CD collection called What Does It Mean to Be a Christian Citizen, featuring our own Dr. James Dobson. We'll be happy to send you a copy as our way of thanking you for your gift of any amount in support of the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute today. So simply go online to drjamesdobson.org/Family Talk. Click the link at the bottom of the page, and we'll be happy to process the transaction for you. Until next time, I'm Roger Marsh. Thanks so much for listening to Family Talk, the voice you trust for the family you love.
This has been a presentation of the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute.
Someone said, if you connect a boy to the right man, he seldom goes wrong, and I believe that to be true. If a dad and a son or a daughter can develop some common interest together, the rebellious years really shouldn't be all that troubling. I had that kind of relationship with my own father, and the full force of his contribution hit me a few years ago when suddenly he lay dying of a major heart attack. As I stood by his bedside, I thought back to the very happiest moments of my childhood. How my dad and I would get up very early on a wintry morning and head about 20 miles outside of town to our favorite place. We'd park the car, we'd climb over a fence, and follow a little creek bed back to an area that I called the Big Woods. He'd get me situated under a fallen tree that made a little secret room, and then we'd wait for the sun to come up, listening to the squirrels and the birds and the chipmunks, and the entire panorama of nature unfolded before us. Those moments together with my dad were absolutely priceless to me. There was a closeness that made me want to be like him, to choose his values as my values, and his dreams as my dreams, and his God as my God. That's the power of a man to set a kid on the right road, and I can think of no wiser investment of time in the entire realm of human experience.
To get involved, go to drjamesdobson.org. Hey everyone, Roger Marsh here for Family Talk. Where can you go to receive support and advice for you and your family? Family Talk interacts with millions of people every day with inspiring advice and tips from Dr. James Dobson on what matters to you the most. Whether it's marriage or parenting, you can be sure our Facebook page will keep you updated with how your family can succeed. Join us each day for the latest broadcast, resources, and inspiration. Nowhere else can you hear a thought of the day from Dr. Dobson, as well as a special message before you say goodnight. Now, you can be sure that every post on our page is created with you and your family in mind. So please take the time to visit us and become part of our online community at facebook.com/Dr. James Dobson's Family Talk. That's facebook.com/Dr. James Dobson's Family Talk.
I want to say a word or two today on behalf of the public schools, and especially the men and women who serve our children there. First, let me acknowledge that I share the concern of many others about falling test scores, increasing violence on campuses, and the high illiteracy rate. But I'm not quick to blame educators for everything that's gone wrong. The teachers and school administrators who guide our children have been among the most maligned and underappreciated people in our society. But I think it's a bum rap. We would still be having serious difficulties in our schools if the professionals did everything right. Why? Because what goes on in the classroom can't be separated from the problems occurring in the culture at large. Educators aren't responsible for the condition our kids are in when they arrive at school each day. It's not the teacher's fault that families are unraveling and that large numbers of their students have been abused, neglected, and undernourished. They can't keep kids from watching mindless television or violent videos until midnight or from using illegal substances and alcohol. In essence, when the culture begins to crumble, the schools will also look bad. That's why, even though I disagree with some of the trends in modern education, I sympathize with the dedicated teachers and principals out there who are doing their best on behalf of our youngsters. They're a discouraged lot today, and they need our support.
To hear more, visit our broadcast page at drjamesdobson.org.